The rain fell upon Ashworth Manor like a verdict rendered from grey autumn skies, each drop striking the ancient stones with the persistence of memory itself, and the carriage that wound its way up the serpentine drive seemed to carry within its dark confines all the weight of debts unpaid and promises broken. Eleanor Vance pressed her palm against the cold glass of the carriage window, watching the manor emerge from the mist like a creature rising from troubled waters, all towers and shadows, and windows that glowed with amber light, yet promised no warmth. She was 24 years old, and she had learned already that life demanded sacrifices from those who could least afford to make them, that dignity was a luxury purchased with suffering, and that love was a word spoken by those who had never known the particular shame of watching a father gamble away every comfort, every security, every future. The carriage shuddered to a halt before great oak doors, and a footman materialized from the gloom to hand her down, his face carefully blank in that way servants perfected when they wished to see nothing and no less. Inside, the entrance hall soared upward into darkness, portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilded frames, and Eleanor's travelling boots echoed against marble floors as she followed a silent butler through corridors that smelled of beeswax, and something older, something that whispered of grief, preserved like flowers pressed between pages. And then he was there, Lord Sebastian Ashworth, standing before a fire that did nothing to soften the hard lines of his face, a man of 32 years who wore his bitterness like armor, forged in some private furnace of pain. He did not smile. He did not extend his hand. He simply looked at her with eyes the color of winter storms, and Eleanor felt the full weight of her reduced circumstances settle upon her shoulders like a mantle she would wear for the rest of her days. "Miss Vance," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like an accusation. "You understand the terms." It was not a question. She understood. Her father's debt staggering, shameful. The accumulated ruin of years spent at card tables and in gambling houses would be paid in full. Her younger sister Clara would have a dowry, a future, a chance at the respectable life that Eleanor herself was now forfeiting. In exchange, Eleanor would become Lady Ashworth, wife to a man who looked upon her with something colder than indifference. "I understand," she replied, and her voice did not waver, though something within her chest felt as though it were cracking along fault lines she had not known existed. Sebastian stepped closer, and the firelight caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the cruel beauty of features that might have been carved from marble by an artist who understood suffering. "Let me be clear," he said, and his voice was low, precise, each word a stone dropped into still water. "This marriage is not about love. It is not about companionship or comfort or any of the tender mercies women dream of. Your father destroyed my family. He ruined my mother with his schemes and his false promises, and she died with his betrayal carved into her heart. This marriage, Miss Vance, is my revenge, and you are the instrument through which I shall finally have satisfaction." The chapel stood apart from the main house, a structure of grey stone and stained glass that had witnessed generations of Ashworth unions, though none perhaps as hollow as the one solemnized on that rain-swept morning when Eleanor Vance became Eleanor Ashworth in name, if nothing else. Rain streaked the ancient windows, transforming the coloured glass saints into weeping figures, their benedictions blurred by weather that seemed determined to echo the solemnity of what transpired within these sacred walls. The pews stretched empty save for a handful of witnesses, Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper, a solicitor with ink-stained fingers who served as legal observer, and a young man Eleanor would later learn was Thomas, Sebastian's younger brother, whose expression held something like pity as he watched her approach the altar. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered hastily by candlelight in the weeks before, ivory silk now slightly yellowed with age, and she thought as she walked that measured path toward her waiting bridegroom, how strange it was that she should wear a gown meant for love while entering a contract built entirely on vengeance. Sebastian stood rigid as a soldier awaiting orders, his dark coat immaculate, his face betraying nothing as the vicar spoke words about sacred bonds and holy matrimony that rang false against the stone walls. Asterisk, I am doing this for Clara, asterisk, Eleanor reminded herself, as she repeated vows that tasted like ash upon her tongue. Asterisk, I am doing this so she might have the life I am surrendering, so she might marry for love as our mother once did, before father destroyed everything he touched, asterisk. When Sebastian placed the ring upon her finger, a circle of cold gold that felt like a shackle, their eyes met, and she saw in his gaze the satisfaction of a man who had finally captured a piece long sought in some private game of retribution. The wedding breakfast was brief, formal, a performance of civility enacted for the servants who would carry tales, and by evening Eleanor found herself installed in chambers that, while beautifully appointed in burgundy and cream, felt as impersonal as rooms in a fine hotel. A maid named Sarah helped her undress, her eyes carefully averted, her manner suggesting she had been warned against too much friendliness, and when Eleanor asked whether Lord Ashworth might be expected, the girl's cheeks flushed crimson. "His lordship keeps his own chambers, my lady," Sarah whispered, "in the west wing. You're not to trouble yourself." Relief and humiliation warred within Eleanor's chest as she understood. This was to be a marriage of separate existences, parallel lines that would never intersect save when public appearance demanded. Later, unable to sleep, she wrapped herself in a shawl and explored the corridor outside her door, her candle casting dancing shadows upon papered walls. She passed door after door until she reached a corridor, blocked by heavy curtains, and when she moved to part them, a voice emerged from the darkness behind her, Mrs. Brennan, appearing like a spectre in her nightclothes. "The east wing is not for visiting, my lady," the housekeeper said, her tone not unkind but firm as iron. "Lord Ashworth's orders. You'll find the rest of the house open to you, but that part belongs to the past." Eleanor retreated to her cold bed, but sleep would not come, for she understood now that she had married not merely a man but a house full of locked doors and forbidden rooms, secrets preserved behind heavy curtains, and somewhere in the darkness, a husband who intended her presence to serve as constant reminder of old wounds he refused to let heal. The days that followed arranged themselves into patterns Eleanor learned to navigate as one learns the particular geography of a prison, mapping which corridors led to cold silence and which offered moments of fragile peace. Ashworth Manor revealed itself slowly, a house of contradictions, where sunlight fell through tall windows onto floors that servants polished to mirrors, yet where shadows seemed to gather in corners, as though darkness itself had taken up residence alongside the living. Mrs. Brennan proved a careful guide, showing Eleanor the morning room where she might take her breakfast, the library whose shelves stretched toward distant ceilings, the conservatory where plants struggled against the coming winter, all while steering her away from Sebastian's study with its perpetually closed door, away from the east wing with its forbidden mysteries, away from anywhere the master might be disturbed. "His lordship keeps to a schedule," Mrs. Brennan explained one morning, her hands busy with household keys that jangled like small warnings. "Breakfast at 7, precisely, in his study alone. He rides the estate boundaries before noon, meets with his steward after, and takes dinner at 8 in the formal dining room, though he rarely requires company." The message was clear. Eleanor's role was to exist without being seen, to occupy space without leaving impression, to be wife in title while remaining stranger in truth. It was Thomas who first broke through the careful isolation, appearing one afternoon in the library, where Eleanor had retreated with a volume of poetry she was not truly reading. He was 3 years younger than Sebastian, with the same dark hair and strong jaw, but where Sebastian's features seemed carved from winter stone, Thomas possessed a warmth that softened every angle, a smile that came easily and often. "So you're the brave soul who agreed to marry my brother," he said, settling uninvited into the chair across from her. "I confess I wanted to meet the woman willing to enter this particular lion's den." They spoke for an hour, and Eleanor learned that Thomas lived in the village, managing a smaller property, visiting the manor only when duty demanded or loneliness drove him, that he worried for Sebastian, had worried for years, watching his brother retreat further into bitterness with each passing season. "He wasn't always this way," Thomas said, and something in his eyes suggested depths of sorrow he was not yet ready to share. "But that is a story for another time, when you know us better, if you choose to stay long enough to learn it." From her window that evening, Eleanor watched Sebastian cross the courtyard below, his stride purposeful, his shoulders rigid beneath his dark coat, and she observed how servants scattered from his path like leaves before wind, how the very air seemed to grow heavier in his presence. Asterisk, he wants me to hate him, asterisk, she realized with sudden clarity. Asterisk, he wants me to be miserable, so his revenge might taste sweeter, but I will not give him that satisfaction, asterisk. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and made herself a promise. She would fulfill her duty with such dignity, such grace, such unshakable composure that Sebastian Ashworth would find no pleasure in her suffering, for she would not allow him to see her suffer at all. Weeks passed in this manner, autumn deepening toward winter, the trees surrounding Ashworth Manor shedding their leaves like the house itself was shedding any pretense of warmth, and Eleanor found herself growing restless within the gilded cage of her purposeless existence, her days filled with nothing but reading and walking, and the careful avoidance of a husband who seemed to prefer her invisible. It was this restlessness that drove her one morning to seek out Sebastian in his study, a territory she had been warned against entering, and when she knocked upon that formidable oak door, she half expected to be turned away by silence alone. "Enter," came his voice, cold as the November frost upon the windows, and she stepped into a room lined with ledgers and maps and the machinery of industry, where Sebastian sat behind a massive desk, his pen suspended above paper, as he regarded her with something between irritation and curiosity. "I wish to be useful," Eleanor said, and she was proud that her voice did not waver. "I have experience managing household accounts my mother taught me before she died, and I maintained our family's books for years before circumstances changed. I would like access to the household ledgers to contribute something meaningful to the running of this estate." Sebastian set down his pen with deliberate slowness, his dark eyes studying her as though she were some curious specimen he had not expected to encounter. "You misunderstand your position, Mrs. Ashworth," he said, and the formal address cut like a blade. "You are not here to be useful. You are here because your presence represents a debt collected, a balance restored. The household runs perfectly well without your interference, as it has for years. Your role is simply to exist within these walls, nothing more, nothing less." Something ignited within Eleanor then, a spark of the fire she had long suppressed in the name of duty and dignity, and she stepped closer to his desk, her hands clenched at her sides. "I am not a painting to be hung upon your wall, my lord," she said, her voice rising despite her intention to remain calm. "I am not a trophy to be displayed as evidence of your victory. If you wished for a ghost, you should have married one. I am flesh and blood, and I will not spend my days in useless ornament while I am capable of contribution." Sebastian rose from his chair, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his gaze, surprise, perhaps, or something dangerously close to respect, before his expression shuttered once more into familiar coldness. "You have spirit," he observed. "I wondered if the Vance family had bred it out of you entirely. The answer is no, Mrs. Ashworth. The ledgers remain my concern alone." He turned away, dismissing her, and Eleanor left with her dignity intact but her frustration burning, retreating to her chambers where she sat by the window and watched darkness claim the grounds below. It was near midnight when she heard it music drifting through the silent house like a ghost's whisper, notes of such haunting melancholy that she found herself drawn from her bed, following the sound through shadowed corridors until she reached the closed doors of the music room, where through the gap beneath flowed candlelight and the most sorrowful piano melody she had ever heard. She did not enter, did not dare, but she pressed her palm against the cold wood and listened to Sebastian Ashworth pour into ivory keys the grief he would never speak aloud, and she understood suddenly that the man who refused her contribution was the same man who played alone in darkness, drowning in depths he would let no one see. The forbidden east wing called to Eleanor in the quiet hours, its sealed doors whispering of secrets that might illuminate the darkness she had married into, and on a grey November afternoon, when Sebastian had ridden out to inspect distant tenant farms and the servants busied themselves in the kitchens below, she found herself standing before those doors, with her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for flight. The handle turned beneath her trembling fingers unlocked, as though the house itself had decided she was ready to know, and she stepped into a corridor where dust motes danced in pale light, filtering through shrouded windows, where the air tasted of roses long dried and grief long held. The rooms she passed showed signs of hasty abandonment, furniture draped in white cloths like ghosts of former grandeur, until she reached the chamber at the corridor's end and stopped upon the threshold, her breath catching at the sight before her. A portrait dominated the far wall, life-sized and luminous despite the dimness, depicting a woman of perhaps 40 years, with Sebastian's dark eyes and the same proud set of jaw. But where his features spoke of winter, this woman radiated warmth, her painted smile suggesting a soul that had known how to love freely and fully. The room around the portrait had been preserved as a shrine, fresh flowers in a crystal vase, their stems recently cut, a writing desk with papers still arranged as though their author might return at any moment, a shawl draped across a chair as if just removed from beloved shoulders. Asterisk. He comes here. Asterisk, Eleanor realized. Asterisk. He tends this room like a wound. He will not let heal. Asterisk. And she understood suddenly that the master of Ashworth Manor was not merely cruel but broken, not simply cold but frozen in a moment of loss he could not release. "You should not be here, my lady," came Mrs. Brennan's voice from behind her, soft with warning and something that might have been compassion, and Eleanor turned to find the housekeeper standing in the doorway, her weathered face etched with old sorrow. "Lady Ashworth," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the portrait. "Sebastian's mother." Mrs. Brennan nodded slowly, moving to stand beside Eleanor, both women gazing up at that painted face that seemed to hold all the warmth the manor now lacked. She was the heart of this house, the light that made Lord Sebastian smile, the reason Lord Thomas laughed still. And when your father's dealings destroyed the family investments, when the shame of it proved too much for her gentle constitution, she simply faded, took to her bed and let go of living, and the master found her, held her as she breathed her last, and something in him died alongside her that cold spring morning. The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, each revelation another weight added to the burden she already carried, and she gripped the back of a dusty chair to steady herself against the magnitude of what her family had wrought. Her father's gambling, his desperate schemes, his willingness to sacrifice anyone for his own salvation. She had known these things abstractly, had borne the shame of his disgrace, but now that shame transformed into something sharper, something personal, for she stood in the room where a mother had died of heartbreak caused by Vance greed. Asterisk. I am the daughter of the man who killed his mother. Asterisk, she thought. Asterisk. And he married me to make me pay for sins I did not commit, but cannot deny. Asterisk. When she left the east wing, carefully closing doors behind her, Eleanor carried new weight upon her shoulders, not the resentment she had nursed like armor against Sebastian's coldness, but guilt that settled into her bones and whispered that perhaps his cruelty was not cruelty at all, but the only language left to a man whose capacity for gentleness had been buried alongside the woman in that portrait, the woman whose smile Eleanor would see now every time she looked into her husband's grieving eyes. Winter descended upon Ashworth Manor like a second marriage, cold, inevitable, and transforming everything it touched, and Eleanor found herself wandering the village one frost-bitten December morning, her breath forming clouds before her as she sought escape from the oppressive silence of a house that seemed to grow smaller with each passing day. It was in the village square that she first noticed them, children huddled in doorways, their faces pinched with cold, and something worse, the dull emptiness of minds left fallow, of futures already narrowing before they had properly begun. "There is no school," the baker's wife told her when Eleanor inquired, her weathered hands never pausing in their kneading. "There was one once, when the old lord lived, but after Lady Ashworth passed and the young master closed himself away, the schoolmaster left for better prospects, and no one thought to replace him. The children work the farms now, or run wild, and learn nothing of letters or numbers or the world beyond these fields." That night, Eleanor could not sleep, her mind turning over possibilities like stones in a riverbed, and by morning she had made her decision without consultation or permission, for she had learned that asking Sebastian Ashworth for anything meant receiving refusal dressed in cold formality. The old chapel at the edge of the village had stood empty for years, its pews dusty but sturdy, its windows still admitting pale winter light, and within a week Eleanor had transformed it into something resembling a schoolroom, with slates she purchased from her small allowance and books she borrowed from the manor's neglected library. The children came hesitantly at first, sent by mothers who remembered Lady Ashworth's kindness and wondered if the new mistress might carry some echo of that warmth, and Eleanor discovered within herself a patience she had not known she possessed, a joy in watching understanding dawn across young faces that made her own troubles seem smaller, more bearable. She was teaching them the alphabet on a grey afternoon, her voice carrying through the chapel as small fingers traced letters on worn slates, when the door opened and Sebastian Ashworth stood silhouetted against the winter sky, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene before him. "You did not ask permission," he said, and Eleanor rose to face him, her chin lifted in defiance, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I did not know I required it to do good," she replied. "These children have nothing, no education, no prospects, no hope of anything beyond the poverty they were born into. If being your wife means anything at all, let it mean I can give them this much." Sebastian's jaw tightened, and for a long moment Eleanor braced herself for the cold dismissal she had come to expect, for the reminder that she was merely a transaction, a debt collected. But he said nothing, simply turned and left, the door closing behind him with a sound that echoed through the chapel like a gavel's fall. She continued teaching, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, and when she glanced toward the frost-rimmed windows an hour later, she saw his carriage, still waiting in the lane, saw him watching through the glass with an expression she could not name. The children departed as darkness fell, and Eleanor walked home through snow that had begun to fall in soft whispers, finding upon her arrival that someone had delivered blankets to the chapel, thick, warm, expensive blankets that bore no note, but carried nonetheless a message she was only beginning to understand. Christmas arrived at Ashworth Manor not with joy, but with a careful, fragile civility that felt to Eleanor like walking across a frozen pond, each step measured, each breath held against the possibility of everything shattering beneath her feet. The great hall had been decorated by Mrs. Brennan's direction. Holly and ivy wound around banisters that had not seen such adornment in years, and candles flickered in windows that looked out upon a world transformed by snow into something almost peaceful, almost forgiving. Thomas had come down from London for the occasion, his presence a buffer between the strained silences that still characterized Eleanor's interactions with Sebastian, and the three of them sat at Christmas dinner, like actors in a play none of them had rehearsed, speaking of weather and estate matters, and anything that did not touch upon the complicated truth of why they were gathered together in the first place. Eleanor had spent weeks preparing her gift, had discovered it quite by accident while cataloguing the neglected library shelves, a slim volume of poetry, its pages worn soft by loving hands, its margins filled with annotations in a feminine script that Eleanor had come to recognize from the letters preserved in the East Wing shrine. Lady Ashworth's favorite verses, her private thoughts recorded in faded ink beside stanzas about love and loss and the endurance of hope through winter's darkest nights, and Eleanor had taken the fragile thing to the village bookbinder, had paid from her small allowance to have it restored and preserved in leather the color of wine, had wrapped it in paper. She decorated herself with pressed winter flowers. When she presented it to Sebastian after dinner, while Thomas busied himself with brandy by the fire, she watched his face for any sign of the cold dismissal she had come to expect, any indication that she had overstepped the invisible boundaries that governed their strange arrangement. But Sebastian Ashworth, who had armored himself so carefully against feeling, who had made cruelty his shield and distance his fortress, simply stood there holding his mother's poetry in hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, his dark eyes moving across the familiar handwriting, his throat working around words that would not come. He left without speaking, the book clutched against his chest like something precious and wounding all at once, and Eleanor told herself she had not hoped for more, had not imagined for even a moment that such a gift might bridge the chasm between them. That night, preparing for bed in her solitary chamber, she found it waiting at her door, a single rose, impossibly white against the dark wood of the threshold, its petals perfect despite the season, clearly grown in some hothouse and cut by hands that had chosen it with care. There was no note, no explanation, only that flower speaking in a language older than words, and Eleanor pressed it to her lips and breathed in its sweetness, and wondered if Sebastian Ashworth even knew he was capable of such gestures, or if this tenderness emerged only when he thought no one was watching. The following evening, she came down to dinner, expecting the usual tray in her room, only to find Sebastian waiting in the dining room, the table set for two, candlelight softening features that seemed less severe somehow, less defended. "I thought," he began, then stopped, as though the words cost him something he was not certain he could afford to spend. "I thought we might dine together, if you are not otherwise occupied." They spoke haltingly that night, of books and music and the small concerns of the estate, and if their conversation resembled two strangers meeting for the first time rather than husband and wife, it was nonetheless a beginning, a crack in armor that had seemed impenetrable, A door opened just wide enough to let in the faintest promise of light. It was Thomas who found her in the library one January afternoon, her fingers tracing the spines of books she had come to know as intimately as the chambers of her own heart. And something in his expression told Eleanor that he had sought her out with purpose, that the casual greeting he offered was merely prelude to words he had been carrying for some time. "You have changed him, you know," Thomas said, settling into the chair across from hers with the easy grace that characterized everything he did, so different from his brother's rigid formality. Oh, he would deny it. Sebastian has always been masterful at denying the things that matter most, but I have watched him these past weeks, watched the way his eyes follow you across rooms, the way he lingers at breakfast hoping you might appear, and I see something I thought I would never see again, the ghost of the brother I remember. Eleanor set aside her book, her pulse quickening at Thomas's words even as she schooled her features into careful neutrality, for she had learned that hope was a dangerous thing in this house, a flame that could warm or consume with equal indifference. "He was not always like this," Thomas continued, his voice softening with memory, his gaze drifting to the frost-laced window as though looking backward through time itself. "When we were boys, Sebastian was the one who laughed loudest, who dreamed biggest, who believed with absolute certainty that the world was good and that goodness would be rewarded. He wanted to build schools for every village on our lands, to modernize the factories so workers need not sacrifice their health for wages, to prove that wealth and compassion could walk hand in hand." Eleanor leaned forward, hungry for these fragments of a man she was only beginning to glimpse beneath the ice, and Thomas obliged her with the generosity of a storyteller who understood his audience's need. "Our mother adored him for it, called him her knight-errant, her proof that the Ashworth name could mean something noble, and then your father came with his schemes and his false promises, and everything collapsed so quickly that none of us could find our footing." Thomas's voice grew heavy with old grief, and Eleanor felt her shame rising like bile in her throat, the familiar weight of sins she had not committed but bore nonetheless. "She died believing we would lose everything, died with Sebastian holding her hand and swearing he would save us somehow. And when the doctors finally pulled him away from her bedside, something in him had turned to stone. He blamed himself. You see, for not recognizing your father's treachery sooner, for being too idealistic to see the wolf beneath the gentleman's clothing, and that guilt has been eating him alive for 7 years. Eleanor's eyes burned with tears. She refused to shed, understanding now why Sebastian's cruelty had felt so practiced, so deliberate. It was not natural to him, but learned. A language of self-protection, adopted by a heart too wounded to risk exposure again. "He married you for revenge," Thomas said quietly, "but I think he is discovering that revenge is a cold companion, and that you are nothing like the monster he needed you to be. Give him time, Eleanor, give him patience, for beneath all that ice there is still a man capable of extraordinary love, if only someone proves to him that love is safe again." The storm descended upon the county with a fury that seemed almost personal, as though the heavens themselves had conspired to trap the inhabitants of Ashworth Manor within walls that had witnessed so much sorrow, and were only now beginning to learn the language of something softer, and Eleanor watched from the drawing-room window as the world beyond the glass dissolved into a chaos of driving snow and winds that howled like wounded creatures seeking shelter they would never find. The servants had been dismissed early that morning to return to their families in the village before the worst arrived. Mrs. Brennan pressing Eleanor's hands with unusual warmth and whispering that she should keep the fires burning and not venture out for any reason. And now the great house stood nearly empty, its corridors echoing with a silence broken only by the relentless assault of winter against ancient stone. It was nearing evening when Eleanor realized Sebastian had not returned from his morning ride to check on the tenant farmers in the outlying cottages, and the fear that gripped her then was so immediate, so visceral, that she understood with sudden clarity how much had changed in these months of careful, halting progress. She was not merely worried for the master of the house, but terrified for the man who had left a white rose at her door, who had sat across from her at dinner and spoken of books with something approaching eagerness in his dark eyes. She was pacing before the fire, her hands twisted together in useless anxiety, when the door crashed open and Sebastian staggered through it, covered in snow that clung to him like a second skin, his face pale as marble, and his lips tinged with a blue that stopped Eleanor's heart in her chest, and before she could think she was running to him, catching him as his legs buckled, her small frame somehow bearing his weight as she guided him toward the hearth and the salvation of its warmth. The fever came on quickly, as fevers born of such exposure often do, and Eleanor found herself in the role of nurse, with no one to help her, stripping away his frozen garments with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the terrible vulnerability of this man who had seemed so invincible in his cruelty, and now lay shivering and senseless beneath blankets she piled upon him, like prayers made manifest in wool and linen. Through the long hours of that night she sat beside him, bathing his burning forehead with cool cloths, forcing sips of water between cracked lips, and listening, always listening to the words that spilled from him in delirium, fragments of a grief he had never allowed himself to speak aloud in waking hours. "Mother, I'm sorry. I should have seen it. I should have protected you. Forgive me. Please forgive me. I have been so alone, so terribly alone, and I made myself into something you would not recognize because it was easier than feeling, easier than remembering your face when you realized we had lost everything." Eleanor wept silently as she held his hand through the fever's worst ravages, understanding at last that the cruel lord she had married was merely a costume worn by a boy who had never stopped grieving, never stopped blaming himself for sins that were never his to carry, and she whispered her own promises into the darkness, promises that she would not leave, that she would not abandon him to the isolation he had built around himself, that if he would only live through this night, she would spend whatever time remained to them proving that he was worthy of the love he had denied himself for so long. The fever broke on the third morning, and Eleanor, who had not slept more than a handful of stolen moments in all that time, found herself weeping with relief when Sebastian's eyes opened and focused upon her face with something like recognition, his voice a ragged whisper, as he asked how long he had been lost to the darkness, and she told him everything except the words he had spoken in his delirium, those sacred confessions she would guard like treasures until he was ready to offer them freely. Recovery came slowly, as recovery from such illnesses must, and with it came a shift in the very air of Ashworth Manor, a softening that the servants noticed first and spoke of in hushed, wondering tones. The master thanked them now, looked at them when he spoke, and most remarkably, he smiled at his wife with an expression that seemed almost shy, as though he were learning an entirely new language and feared making errors. Sebastian brought Eleanor tea one afternoon as she sat reading by the fire, his hands uncertain as he placed the cup beside her, and when she looked up at him with surprise, he merely said that she must be exhausted from her vigil, and that he owed her a debt he could not begin to calculate. And though the words were formal, the warmth beneath them made Eleanor's heart flutter like a caged bird, sensing the approach of spring. She began reading aloud to him during his convalescence, novels and poetry and histories that sparked discussions, lasting long into the evening hours, and Eleanor discovered that Sebastian possessed a mind as sharp as any scholar's, that his opinions were nuanced and thoughtful, that he genuinely wished to know what she thought, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. This was a man who had been lonely for so long that conversation itself had become a feast. He approached with wondering hunger. "Mrs. Brennan smiled knowingly when she observed them taking breakfast together. When she noticed that Sebastian had begun asking Eleanor's opinions on estate matters he had once guarded jealously, when she saw the master linger at doorways simply to watch his wife pass through them, and the old housekeeper permitted herself a small prayer of gratitude that love might yet take root in soil that had seemed so barren. The moment came on an ordinary evening, unremarkable in every way except for what transpired between them. They were reaching for the same book of sonnets, both having thought to read aloud that night, and their hands met upon the leather binding with a touch that sent something electric through Eleanor's entire being. And she looked up to find Sebastian frozen, his dark eyes locked upon their joined fingers, as though witnessing a miracle he dared not believe. Neither pulled away, and in that suspension of breath and time, something irrevocable passed between them, an acknowledgement that the walls they had both constructed were crumbling faster than either could rebuild them, and perhaps, just perhaps, that destruction was not something to fear but to welcome, like the first thaw after a winter that had lasted far too long. Spring announced itself first in small rebellions against winter's grip, a softening of the frost upon the windows, a tentative birdsong breaking the dawn silence, the first brave crocuses pushing through soil that had seemed frozen beyond hope of renewal. And it was on such a morning, when the light fell golden through the breakfast room and painted Eleanor's hair with threads of amber, that Sebastian set down his cup and asked a question that would change everything. "If you could alter anything about this estate, what would it be?" Eleanor, startled by such an invitation from a man who had once declared her nothing more than a transaction, considered carefully before speaking of the garden she had glimpsed from the east wing windows, the one that lay behind the manor in tangled ruin, choked with weeds and brambles that obscured what must once have been magnificent. She had learned from Mrs. Brennan that this had been Lady Ashworth's particular joy, her sanctuary, the place where she had taught a young Sebastian the names of flowers and the patience required to coax beauty from the earth, and Eleanor watched something flicker across her husband's face at the mention of it. Pain and longing intertwined like the very vines that had consumed his mother's legacy. She expected refusal, expected the walls to rise again as they always did when the past was invoked, but instead, Sebastian was silent for a long moment before saying, his voice rough with emotion, he no longer tried entirely to hide, that perhaps it was time to bring something back to life, rather than continuing to let it die. And so began the project that would become their unspoken courtship, their dialogue conducted in soil and seed, and the shared labor of resurrection. They worked together in those lengthening days of early spring, Sebastian shedding his coat and rolling his sleeves to reveal forearms that spoke of strength he had hidden beneath the armor of a gentleman's attire. Eleanor, kneeling in the dirt without care for her gown, and in this leveling of station and pretense, they found a freedom to speak that formal drawing rooms had never permitted. He told her of his mother's laugh, how it had sounded like music, how she had believed that growing things was an act of faith in tomorrow, and Eleanor shared her own small dreams, the teaching she wished to expand, the books she longed to write, the quiet life she had imagined before duty had demanded sacrifice. Laughter returned to Ashworth Manor, surprising them both the first time it escaped Sebastian's lips at some jest Eleanor made about his inexpert pruning, and she realized she had never heard him laugh before, that this sound, full and warm and utterly unguarded, was a gift more precious than any of the jewels that sat untouched in her chamber, and she caught him looking at her afterward with an expression of wondering bewilderment, as though he too was discovering something he had believed lost forever. The garden began to take shape beneath their hands, beds cleared and planted, pathways restored, a rose arbor rebuilt where his mother's favorite climbers would eventually bloom, and with each day spent in this shared creation, Eleanor understood that they were cultivating something far more significant than flowers. They were nurturing the tender, fragile possibility that two wounded hearts might yet learn to beat in harmony. The afternoon had been gentle, Eleanor and Sebastian working side by side to stake the young climbing roses that would one day cascade over the restored arbor, their conversation easy with the comfort of growing familiarity, when the sound of carriage wheels upon gravel shattered the peace with a violence that seemed almost physical. Eleanor knew before she turned, knew with the sick certainty of a child who has learned to recognize the particular cadence of approaching disaster, and her face drained of color as she watched her father descend from a hired hack, his clothing disheveled, his gait unsteady with drink even at this early hour, and Sebastian felt her freeze beside him, felt the joy drain from her body like water from a cracked vessel, and something dangerous stirred in his chest at the sight of fear in her eyes. Henry Vance had aged poorly since Eleanor had last seen him, the ravages of drink and desperation carving deep grooves into a face that had once been handsome, and he advanced upon them with the belligerent entitlement of a man who had never accepted that his downfall was of his own making, demanding to know why his letters had gone unanswered, why his son-in-law had refused his reasonable requests for additional funds, calling Eleanor an ungrateful wretch who owed him everything and had repaid him with abandonment. And Sebastian watched as Eleanor seemed to shrink, her shoulders curving inward, her voice small as she tried to placate and redirect, and he recognized with sickening clarity the posture of someone who had spent years navigating abuse, who had learned that invisibility was the only safety. The tirade continued, Henry's voice rising as he catalogued Eleanor's failures, her plain face, her stubborn nature, her inability to secure a proper match before Sebastian's offer, her pathetic attachment to her sister, who was equally worthless, and Sebastian saw Eleanor flinch at each accusation as though struck by physical blows, saw tears gathering in eyes that she fought to keep steady, and the rage that rose within him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. a fury so profound it bordered on the sacred, because this man had wounded her in ways that left no visible marks but had shaped the very architecture of her soul. Sebastian stepped forward, placing himself between Eleanor and her father with a coldness that made his previous distance seem like warmth by comparison, and his voice when he spoke was quiet with the particular menace of a man who need not raise his voice to destroy, informing Henry Vance that he would leave immediately and never return, that any future contact would be handled through solicitors, that if he ever spoke to Eleanor in such a manner again, Sebastian would ensure he spent his remaining years in a debtor's prison from which no amount of begging would secure release, and something in his eyes must have penetrated even Henry's drunken fog, for the older man retreated, muttering threats that held no power, climbing back into his hack with the particular cowardice of bullies confronted by someone they cannot intimidate. Only when the carriage had disappeared did Sebastian turn to Eleanor, and what he saw undid him completely. She was shaking, silent tears streaming down her cheeks, her arms wrapped around herself as though she might fly apart without that anchor, and he moved to her without thought, gathering her against his chest with a tenderness he had not known himself capable of, holding her as years of swallowed pain finally broke free, her sobs muffled against his coat while he murmured words of comfort into her hair, and vowed silently that she would never feel unprotected again, that his arms would be her shelter for as long as she would have them, that loving her, for he could no longer deny that this was love, meant standing between her and every storm that dared approach. The moon hung low and luminous over the restored garden, its silver light transforming the tender new growth into something ethereal, otherworldly. And Eleanor had come here seeking solace as she often did now, seeking the peace that this place of resurrection offered, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her and knew without turning that Sebastian had followed, that he too was drawn to this sanctuary they had built together, from ruin and memory, and the tentative hope of something neither had dared name. She did not speak as he came to stand beside her, both of them gazing at the roses that had begun to climb the arbor, where his mother's favorites would soon bloom again, and the silence between them was no longer the cold void it had once been, but rather a comfortable presence, a space where words could form slowly without the pressure of expectation, until Sebastian finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion that seemed to cost him everything to release. "I find I cannot do it anymore." Eleanor turned to him, her heart seizing with sudden fear that he meant their fragile peace, this beautiful becoming that had grown between them, but his face in the moonlight held no coldness, only a terrible vulnerability that she had glimpsed before in fever dreams and fleeting moments, but never so nakedly offered. And he continued as though the words were being pulled from some deep place long sealed, telling her that he had tried, God help him, he had tried, to hate her as he had planned, to make her pay for every tear his mother had wept, for every night he had lain awake, listening to her cry through the walls of a house stripped of its dignity by her father's greed. But somewhere between the autumn of her arrival and this moonlit spring, she had undone every careful brick of his hatred, had slipped through his defenses like water through stone, and he was left with nothing but the terrifying truth that his revenge had become his redemption, his punishment had become his peace, and he did not know what to do with a heart that had learned to feel again when he had been so certain it had forgotten how. Eleanor listened with tears sliding silently down her cheeks, and when he finished, she asked the question that had haunted her through every gentle moment, every shared laugh, every accidental touch that had lingered longer than accident could explain. Could he truly love her, knowing what name she carried, knowing that Vance's blood ran through her veins, that she was the daughter of the man who had destroyed everything he cherished? And Sebastian turned to her fully then, taking her hands in his with a tenderness that made her breath catch, and his answer came with the weight of absolute conviction. "I love you because of who you are, not in spite of where you came from, for you have shown me that the sins of fathers need not be inherited, that courage can bloom in the most poisoned soil, that a name is merely letters, while a soul is everything, and yours, Eleanor, is the most beautiful I have ever encountered. I love you, not the woman I thought I was punishing, but the woman who taught village children without permission, who nursed me through fever without obligation, who wept for my mother's garden and helped me bring it back to life. And if you can find it within yourself to love a man who began as your enemy, I will spend every remaining day proving myself worthy of such grace." The answer Eleanor gave required no words, for she rose on trembling toes and pressed her lips to his, and in that first true kiss beneath the silver moon, in the garden they had resurrected from neglect and sorrow, something that had been broken in both of them, finally mended his arms, came around her as though he had been waiting his entire life to hold her thus, and she melted into his embrace with the relief of someone who had wandered, lost, and finally found home. And when at last they parted, breathless and transformed, Sebastian pressed his forehead to hers and whispered her name like a prayer, like a promise, like the first word of a new language they would spend their lives learning together, and the roses his mother had once tended seemed to lean toward them in blessing, their fragrance sweetening the night air with the perfume of second chances. The days that followed held a quality of dreamlike wonder, every glance exchanged, carrying the weight of revelation, every accidental touch now permitted to linger with intention, and Thomas watched his brother's transformation with eyes that grew suspiciously bright, remarking to Mrs. Brennan that he had thought the Sebastian he remembered from childhood was lost forever, only to find him returning in degrees with every smile Eleanor coaxed forth, and the household staff moved through their duties with lighter steps. For Ashworth Manor had begun to feel like a home rather than a mausoleum, warmth seeping into corners that had known only cold formality for years beyond counting. It was Sebastian who suggested they return to the chapel where their loveless ceremony had taken place, who asked Eleanor if she would consent to speak new vows, not the hollow recitations of their contracted union, but words that meant something, promises born of choice rather than coercion. And Eleanor wept when she agreed, wept for the girl who had walked that aisle in resignation and the woman she had become who would walk it again in joy. They went alone, just the two of them, on an afternoon when spring sunlight streamed through the stained glass and painted them in colors of gold and rose and verdant green. And there, where rain had once wept against the windows like tears for a doomed arrangement, Sebastian took Eleanor's hands and vowed to love her with every breath remaining to him, to honor her strength and cherish her gentleness, to spend his days proving worthy of the grace she had shown in forgiving what should have been unforgivable. And Eleanor vowed in return to stand beside him through whatever shadows might come, to help him carry the grief he had borne alone, to build with him a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. And when they kissed to seal these private promises, the chapel that had witnessed their cold beginning now blessed their warm becoming. That evening, Eleanor's things were moved to the master chambers, and she entered the room that had been Sebastian's solitary refuge, to find it transformed with flowers from their garden, candles casting golden light across the bed they would now share, and Sebastian waiting with a vulnerability in his eyes that moved her beyond words, this proud man who had learned to let his walls crumble. And as the door closed behind them, Ashworth Manor settled into a peace it had not known in decades, its stones themselves seeming to sigh with contentment as love finally took residence within its ancient halls. The letter arrived on a morning when summer had finally begun to warm the stones of Ashworth Manor, when Eleanor had awakened in Sebastian's arms with the drowsy contentment of one who has learned to trust in happiness, and the sight of the messenger's urgent face as he pressed the creased paper into Mrs. Brennan's hands sent a chill through the sunlit halls that Eleanor felt before she even knew its cause. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the trembling script of her younger sister Clara, and as she read the desperate words, her face drained of all color, her hands shaking so violently that Sebastian had to take the letter from her fingers and read it himself, his expression darkening with each line that revealed the depth of Clara's peril. Abandoned by a suitor who had promised marriage, and instead left her with nothing but shame and debts in a cheap London lodging, too proud to write until illness had stripped her of options, fever consuming her, alone and frightened, and begging Eleanor's forgiveness for troubling her when she knew their father had already caused such pain, and Eleanor's cry of anguish echoed through the manor as she clutched Sebastian's arm and told him she must go, she must leave immediately. Clara was all she had left of family worth claiming, the sister she had sacrificed everything to protect, and she could not lose her to poverty and sickness in some forgotten corner of the city. Sebastian's response came without hesitation, without the calculation that had once defined his every action, for he simply called for the carriage to be prepared and informed Mrs. Brennan that they would be travelling to London within the hour, and when Eleanor looked at him with desperate gratitude and began to stammer that he need not trouble himself, that she could manage alone, He silenced her with a look that brooked no argument and words that wrapped around her heart like a promise. "Where you go, I go. Your sister's welfare is now my concern as surely as your own, and I will not have you face this terror without me beside you." The journey to London passed in a blur of anxious miles, Eleanor unable to eat or rest, her mind conjuring terrible images of Clara's suffering, and Sebastian held her hand through every jolting hour, speaking little but present in a way that anchored her when fear threatened to sweep her away entirely, and when they finally arrived at the address, Clara had given a mean little room in a boarding house that reeked of cabbage and despair. Eleanor's worst fears were confirmed in the sight of her sister's wasted form, barely recognizable beneath the ravages of fever, her breathing shallow and her skin burning to the touch, and Eleanor fell to her knees beside the narrow bed with a sob that seemed to tear from her very soul. Sebastian was already moving, already summoning the landlady with commands that carried the weight of wealth and authority, already dispatching messengers for the finest physicians London could provide, his purse open without question or limit, and as Eleanor cradled her sister's hand and whispered prayers she had not spoken since childhood, she understood with piercing clarity that the man who had once sought to punish her through marriage was now fighting with every resource he possessed to save the one person she loved most in this world. The weeks that followed blurred into an endless vigil of hope and terror, of sleepless nights, spent watching Clara's chest rise and fall, with breaths that seemed too shallow, too uncertain, and Eleanor existed in a state of suspended anguish that would have destroyed her, had Sebastian not been there steadfast as stone, tireless as the tide managing every detail she could not bring herself to consider, paying the physicians who came and went with grave expressions, securing better lodgings when it became clear Clara could not be moved far, ensuring that food appeared before Eleanor even when she insisted she could not eat, and sitting beside her through the darkest hours when Clara's fever spiked, and Eleanor was certain she would lose her sister to the same cruel fate that had claimed so much else, his hand wrapped around hers like an anchor, preventing her from drowning in despair. He spoke little during those long nights, for Sebastian had never been a man of easy words, but his presence said everything the way he learned the physicians' names and questioned them with sharp intelligence about treatments and prognoses, the way he personally went to the apothecary when medicines were needed rather than trusting servants with something so vital, the way he held Eleanor when she finally collapsed into exhausted weeping and whispered against her hair that Clara would survive, that he would not allow any other outcome, that the Ashworth fortune existed precisely for moments such as this. Slowly, achingly slowly, Clara began to improve. The fever broke on the 12th night, and though she remained weak as a newborn kitten, her eyes, when they opened, held recognition, held life, and Eleanor wept with relief as she clutched her sister's thin hand and promised her that everything would be well now, that she was safe, that she would never be alone again. It was during Clara's recovery, in the quiet moments when Eleanor could finally breathe without fear constricting her chest, that her sister truly saw Sebastian for the first time, not the cold lord Eleanor had described in her early letters, not the instrument of revenge their father's sins had wrought, but the man who brought Eleanor tea without being asked, and who read aloud from novels in the evenings to give Eleanor's voice rest, who had put his entire life on hold without complaint or resentment to stand beside his wife through her darkest hour. "He loves you," Clara whispered one afternoon when Sebastian had stepped out to arrange their eventual return journey, her voice still fragile but her eyes sharp with the perception that illness had not dimmed, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she nodded and admitted that yes, somehow, impossibly, he did, and she loved him in return, loved him more deeply than she had ever imagined possible when she had first entered Ashworth Manor as a sacrifice to her father's debts. That evening, when Clara had drifted into healing sleep, Sebastian drew Eleanor to the window of their modest lodging, where London stretched grey and endless beneath a twilight sky, and he turned her face toward his with gentle fingers and spoke words she would carry in her heart forever. "Your battles are mine now. Eleanor, your sorrows, your fears, your joys, all of it belongs to both of us, and I will spend my life proving that the transaction that brought us together has become the greatest blessing I have ever known." The journey back to Ashworth Manor felt nothing like Eleanor's first arrival on that rain-soaked autumn evening, when she had come as a stranger to a house of shadows, for now the carriage carried not one woman, bound by duty, but 3 souls, knitted together by love and trial. Sebastian steady at her side, Clara pale but strengthening against the cushions opposite, her eyes wide with wonder as the countryside unfolded green and golden beneath summer's generous sun. And when the manor finally rose into view, its stones no longer seemed cold and forbidding, but warm with promise, with the accumulated weight of transformation that had occurred within those walls. And Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as she realized she was bringing her sister home in truth, to a place where both of them would be cherished rather than merely tolerated. Sebastian had written ahead, and Mrs. Brennan had prepared everything with the quiet efficiency that masked deep affection, but it was Sebastian's decision about the East Wing that struck Eleanor most profoundly when he led Clara through those long forbidden doors and showed her the rooms he had ordered, renovated, not the preserved shrine to grief that Eleanor had discovered in secret so many months ago, but bright chambers with fresh wallpaper and new linens, and windows thrown open to catch the breeze from the gardens below. And when Clara gasped at the beauty of the space that would be hers, Sebastian simply said that the East Wing had been closed long enough, that his mother would have wanted it filled with life rather than left as a monument to sorrow, and Eleanor understood that in opening those rooms he was finally releasing the grip of the past that had held him prisoner for so long. The summer unfurled like a gift around them. Clara grew stronger with each passing week, colour returning to her cheeks as she explored the gardens and the grounds. And Thomas, dear Thomas, found excuses to visit more frequently than duty required, his eyes following Clara with an interest that made Eleanor smile knowingly. And through it all the estate flourished under Eleanor's care. The village school now properly established, the tenants speaking of their lady with genuine affection, the household humming with a contentment that seemed almost miraculous to those who remembered the manor's darker days. It was in late summer, when the roses Sebastian's mother had once planted were exploding in riotous bloom throughout the restored garden, that Eleanor first noticed the changes in her own body, the morning sickness she tried to hide, the exhaustion that crept over her despite her happiness. And when she finally whispered her suspicions to Sebastian one evening, as they walked the garden paths, his face transformed through a dozen emotions in rapid succession: shock, then fear, then a joy so profound and vulnerable that it nearly broke her heart to witness. He gathered her in his arms with trembling reverence and spoke against her hair in a voice thick with emotion, confessing that he had never imagined himself worthy of fatherhood, that he had feared passing on the coldness that had nearly consumed him. But Eleanor pressed her hand to his cheek and reminded him of all he had become, all they had built together from the ruins of revenge and duty, and she told him that any child of theirs would know nothing but love, for they had learned together how to transform pain into tenderness, and their family would be the living proof that even the darkest arrangements could bloom into the warmest homes. Autumn returned to Ashworth Manor with its golden light and crisp winds, painting the gardens in amber and rust, and Eleanor watched the leaves drift past her window with the profound awareness that exactly 1 year had passed since she first arrived at these doors, a frightened sacrifice to her father's debts, a pawn in a game of revenge she had not fully understood, and now she lay in the master chambers with Sebastian's hand clasped in hers, her body racked with the pains of labour, while the midwife spoke encouragements, and Clara pressed cool cloths to her forehead, and through the haze of exhaustion and fear, she found herself marvelling at how completely her life had transformed, how the cold transaction had become this moment of bringing new life into a home now filled with warmth and hope. The hours stretched endless and agonizing, and Sebastian refused to leave despite propriety's demands that husbands wait elsewhere, his face pale with helpless terror as he watched Eleanor suffer, and when at last the final push brought forth a wailing cry that filled the chamber with the unmistakable sound of new life, Eleanor saw Sebastian's expression shatter into something raw and unguarded, wonder and fear and love so overwhelming that tears streamed freely down his cheeks as the midwife placed their son in his trembling arms. He held the infant James, they would call him, after Sebastian's grandfather, the last Ashworth who had known true happiness, with such terrified reverence that Eleanor would have laughed if she had possessed the strength. This powerful man, who commanded industries and estates, rendered utterly helpless by a creature small enough to cradle in his 2 hands. And when he finally looked up at Eleanor, his voice broke as he whispered that he did not know how to be a father, that he had learned coldness and distance from his own, that he feared poisoning this innocent soul with the bitterness that had consumed him for so long. But Eleanor reached for him, drawing him down to sit beside her on the bed, and she placed her hand over his, where it supported their son's head, and told him what she had come to understand through their long journey together, that the very fact of his fear proved he would be different, that a man who worried about repeating his father's mistakes was already choosing another path, that she had watched him learn to love when he believed himself incapable, had watched walls crumble that he had built to last a lifetime, and she knew with absolute certainty that he would give James everything he himself had been denied: patience, presence, unconditional devotion. In the days that followed, Eleanor watched the transformation unfold like the final movement of a symphony building toward resolution. Sebastian, who had once locked himself in his study for hours to avoid human connection, now found excuses to visit the nursery at all hours, standing over the cradle with an expression of fierce protective tenderness that made her heart ache with gratitude. The servants whispered in amazement at the master who had become gentle, who smiled readily, who held his heir with hands that had once signed documents of cold revenge and now traced the delicate features of his sleeping son with trembling wonder. And Eleanor understood that the marriage born of vengeance had accomplished something far greater than either of them could have imagined, creating not merely a union, but a family. Not merely a family, but a legacy of love that would redeem all the pain that had come before. 5 years had painted themselves across Ashworth Manor in layers of joy and growth, and the garden that Eleanor and Sebastian had restored together had become legendary throughout the county. Visitors travelled from distant estates to walk its winding paths, to marvel at the roses that cascaded over ancient stone walls and the lavender borders that hummed with bees in summer. But none of them knew the true history written in those blooms, the story of 2 wounded souls who had found their way back to life while working side by side in the soil, and on this particular autumn afternoon, with golden light slanting through copper leaves and the air carrying that familiar scent of wood smoke and ripening apples, Eleanor stood at the garden's heart watching James, now a sturdy boy of 5 with his father's dark hair and her own grey eyes, chase his younger sister Catherine through the hedgerows, their laughter ringing out like bells across the grounds where silence had once reigned supreme. The manor had transformed as completely as its master, no longer a monument to grief and revenge, but a home, alive with the chaos and warmth of family. Clara's embroidery frame stood by the morning-room window, where she sat in quiet contentment, her hand resting on the swell of her belly as she watched her husband Thomas read aloud from the newspaper. Their own love story having unfolded naturally in the years since she came to recover, blossoming from gratitude into friendship, into something deeper that surprised no one, except perhaps themselves. And Sebastian, the man who had once locked himself away from all human connection, now spent his evenings teaching James to play the piano, the same instrument that had once echoed with melancholic isolation, now filling the house with stumbling scales and patient laughter. He found Eleanor in the garden as the children's nurse gathered them for their afternoon rest, and he took her hand as naturally as breathing, leading her along the path they had walked 1,000 times through seasons of planting and pruning and harvest, past the bench where they had shared their first confession of love, beneath the arbor where roses his mother had planted decades ago still bloomed faithfully each summer, and when they reached the small fountain at the garden's center, dry and crumbling when they began this work, now singing with clear water, he stopped and turned to face her with an expression that still held, after all these years, that edge of wonder she had first glimpsed in his eyes when their son was born. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion, "about that night you arrived, the rain, the cold, my determination to make you suffer for sins that were never yours, and I cannot reconcile that man with who I am now, standing here with you, watching our children play in a garden that was dead before you brought it back to life." Eleanor reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that time had carved there, lines of laughter now rather than bitterness, and she remembered too the fear, the resignation, the desperate clinging to duty as her only compass through an impossible situation, and she marveled at the alchemy that had transformed arrangement into devotion, transaction into tenderness. "I thought I was punishing you," Sebastian continued, his voice breaking slightly on the words he had clearly been carrying for some time, waiting for this moment, this perfect autumn echo of their beginning. "I thought revenge would heal something broken in me. Instead, you saved me. Eleanor, you saved me from becoming the monster I was so determined to be." She smiled at him. This man who had learned to love against every instinct, who had torn down his own walls brick by brick, and she spoke the truth that had crystallized over years of building a life together. "We saved each other. Sebastian, that is the miracle neither of us expected when this began." That evening, as winter's first frost painted delicate crystals across the windows of Ashworth Manor, the family gathered in the great drawing room where firelight danced across faces, transformed by years of love. James sat cross-legged on the carpet, teaching young Catherine the rules of chess, while Clara and Thomas shared a settee, her head resting against his shoulder as his hand traced gentle circles on her rounded belly, and Sebastian and Eleanor occupied the chairs nearest the hearth, her fingers intertwined with his as they watched the scene before them with the quiet contentment of those who have weathered storms and emerged into harbour. And in this moment of perfect peace, where the only sounds were the crackle of flames and the soft murmur of children's voices and the occasional turning of a page, it seemed impossible to remember that this house had once been a monument to grief, that these rooms had echoed with loneliness, that the man whose eyes now shone with gentle warmth had once declared this marriage an instrument of revenge. Dear listener, if you have travelled with us through this long tale of two souls who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, perhaps you have recognized something of yourself in their journey. Perhaps you too have known the weight of duty that seems to crush all hope of happiness, or the bitter satisfaction of walls built so high that no pain can reach you, or the terrifying vulnerability of letting another person see the wounded places you have hidden from all the world. And if so, then let their story be a lamp unto your own dark paths, illuminating the truth that we cannot know what our suffering will bring, that the arrangements made in coldness can become the warmest homes, that the heart's capacity for transformation exceeds our most desperate imaginings. Eleanor had arrived at these doors believing herself a sacrifice, a transaction, a pawn in games played by men who cared nothing for her soul. And Sebastian had welcomed her, believing that revenge would heal the wounds his mother's death had carved into his spirit. Neither could have foreseen that duty would become devotion, that proximity would breed understanding, that the slow accumulation of small kindnesses would build a bridge across the chasm of old grievances. And yet here they sat, surrounded by children who would never know the cold distance Sebastian had endured, by family bonds forged, not from obligation but from the truest and most resilient love. So if you find yourself tonight in circumstances that seem impossible to bear, in arrangements not of your choosing, in prisons built by others' sins or your own desperate bargains, take heart from this truth. Walls can crumble, hearts can heal, and sometimes the very chains we believe will destroy us become the ties that bind us to our greatest joy. It requires only patience, the courage to remain open when closing off would be easier, and the faith that even the most frozen ground can welcome seeds that will bloom into gardens more beautiful than we dared to dream. May you find, dear listener, the peace that Eleanor and Sebastian discovered. May your coldest seasons yield to springs of unexpected warmth. May you have the strength to let your walls crumble and the grace to forgive both others and yourself. And when the fire burns low and the night grows quiet, may you rest in the knowledge that love, patient and persistent, has the power to redeem even the darkest of beginnings, transforming revenge into tenderness, duty into devotion, and two broken hearts into one unshakable home.